YouTube! Someone on the internet has just given an opinion. Schrödinger's trap. I don't know actually what this video is about. It's something to do with Jesse Cotton. But here's the thing. Jesse Cotton, while he might be a 4 or 5-time YCS champion, 3-4-time Worlds competitor, I also have topped the regional. I've got like, multiple YouTuber Grand Championship wins. So we're very similar as players, and it's good to just have this conversation. So let's see what he's got for us today.
I'm often asked, how do you improve at Yu-Gi-Oh?
Me too.
How do you get better to the point where you're a top-performing player, constantly doing well, and can win in
the timing on this Keck W.
in spots where you're behind and otherwise shouldn't be able to win? Now, there's no one element that'll get you to that point.
I like that they actually put a periodic table for saying the word element.
One that I feel like is often overlooked is the art of bluffing, especially in modern Yu-Gi-Oh.
Whoa.
On Discord.
Thank you, Spatula. Whoa. Bluffing is a very gray area with tournament policy here. Is this really what he's going to talk about? Like, genuinely, I'm not, like, memeing around here. Like, bluffing, quote-unquote, is a pretty gray area in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, a lot of people think, like, faking a response, for example, is, like, a bluff, for example. This is, like, I'm just taking a little tangent here. He might not be talking about this, but this is kind of important, right? A lot of people might be under the impression and genuinely think if, your opponent summons 5 times and you say, how many summons is that? Thinking, and then you say, okay, go ahead. That's not bluffing. That would get you, like, potentially game lost, right? If you don't have an Ibiru in your hand, if you're just stopping the game for no real reason, you don't actually have a response, that right there is an example of an illegal bluff, right? It's not a very good one, but yeah. Anyway, we'll see what he says regardless. But just as an example, like, bluffing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a pretty gray area. You can't do that.
Specifically, I'm talking about something that I've dubbed Schrödinger's trap.
Oh.
Now, if you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, I have made a video on the concept, so go check that out first to get an understanding of
Yu-Gi-Oh! And science go hand in hand.
Of what I'm saying. But why does this matter? Well, YCS Raleigh took place last weekend, and in the finals, I think the Labyrinth player, Jack Zed, had a ginormous opportunity that he missed because he didn't really incorporate this principle into his gameplay. So, before we continue on to the actual match...
He did lose that game because of misplaying, to be fair, but I'm curious what he's going to analyze. This is interesting.
Let's get a quick rundown on what Schrödinger's trap is. Okay, so it's a play on the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger's physics thought experiment, Schrödinger's...
Austria is a great country, man. YCS Sydney is one of the best locations. If you guys haven't been to YCS Sydney in Austria, it's really good.
Cat. In which we'd have a cat inside of a box with
no!
poison or with a bomb, with 50% chance to kill the cat over the course of the next hour.
No!
After the hour is up, before we open the box, is the cat alive or dead? Well, without observing it, we don't know. It's both alive and dead at the same time. And that's the principle I use with traps. Until we can observe...
It's a little bit more in-depth than that with quantum physics and the quantum realm. But let's, you know what? Pop the baby, rescue cat, Schrödinger's trap. Kind of the same thing. We'll go with that.
A trap card, the set card in the opponent's field, it could act as multiple things at the same time. And as someone who's playing against a bunch of trap cards, we must play around each of them. Now, where this can matter is, as the player who controls the trap card, know the power of that set variable is almost more important sometimes than the trap itself. And by shotgunning your cards too early, you give up that leverage. But it comes up in a different way.
As a very simple principle of, like, a device is one of the things that newer players will fall into is activating responses too early. Your opponent activates a card. If your Ash Blossom immediately meets that condition, they just, like, shotgun it, right? You know, like the glowing button on Mastodon meme of just, yep, click yes to anything. It's a bit of a funny meme, but unironically, like, even in paper Yu-Gi-Oh! In real life, like, that is one thing to actually help up your game, is to maybe think about your responses and holding cards. Obviously, you can hold too much, but just as a general, like, rule of thumb, most newer players do mess up by just using things too early.
Here in the YCS finals. So
just as a side point.
The YCS final starts with Jack Z taking the die roll win. He leads off with an Ariana here.
He is saying Z, right? Jack Z? He's not saying Jack Zeef, right? I'm not mishearing that because I have Yugi Tuber brain rot.
Add a Chandelier from neck to hand. He discards it and a backjack. Pretty good start setting a big welcome labyrinth. Pretty standard setup. And the backjack here reveals 3 cards. Now we get spoiled. As someone who's watching, we can see with Jack that there's not really a good option here on the top of his deck. The only trap card
What was that middle card? Was it Big Welcome?
There is another big welcome labyrinth, which effectively doesn't do anything. So this backjack will have to be used later or blindly when he uses big welcome to shuffle his deck. But until then, it's not going to serve too much of a purpose. He follows up the turn with a simple set card, and he passes. Nothing fantastic, but that's what Labyrinth does. So now it's Cameron's turn up with Snake Eye.
Oh.
He leads
What was that drive-by on Labyrinth there, dude?
with Bonfire for Snake Eye Ash. Snake Eye Ash is summoned and met with infinite permanence. Now, that's a big help to Cameron because that's immediately one variable out of the way. Now, it's important to note that set cards aren't the only variables anymore. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, because of hand traps and other cards, anything that has a variable disruption that can turn into multiple different things presents the threat of multiple different negates or interrupts or disruptions. This backjack also counts as one. So as Cameron is playing his turn, he doesn't know this backjack is a whiff. He has to play around pretty much any trap card in the game still, as if there's another set card thanks to the backjack, until he has a way to either force it out or negate it. But next up here, he's going to press forward. We see a 1-2 come down, and we get the Die Belser, the Black Witch, which is used sending a Poplar, which will give him the send ability for Ash or original Simple Spoil later, but also will grab the Simple Spoil with Black Witch. At this point, it's a pretty clear play for Cameron. If he can get to Dark Charmer and then revive his opponent's Chandelier and then make Celine, he'll have 3 spells, be able to revive Black Witch, make Appaloosa. He'll turn off any of the monster effects disruptions that Jack has. Only really big welcome would be left, and we find out later that Cameron has that covered. So he goes for the Dark Charmer play, and Jack responds with this big welcome labyrinth, fully aware of what Cameron is trying to set up. But, as I said, this big welcome is met with Ash Blossom. So this means that the Dark will connect, but also this backjack will only get dead cards now. But again, it's important to remember, Cameron doesn't know that. He technically still will be playing around this card for the rest of this duel. But from Cameron's perspective, there are no back row left. The only disruptions until his backjack is used are via monster form. So if he can get to this Appaloosa, he is in a pretty good shape. He presses forward, makes the Celine, and there, Jack meets him with Nibiru. Cameron still has a Sinful Spoil. He has a Poplar still up, and with that gone, Cameron has no problem pressing forward. He gets the Oak out.
I don't have much to say at this point. I'm just like, this is just really interesting.
Gets the Trigger Poplar, and from there, the very cookie cutter Snake Eye OTK proceeds to play out. Jack has no answers, and he loses. But what if Jack doesn't use Nibiru there? The Appaloosa comes down, and from there, the next piece of play is obviously the Sinful Spoils. It's going to send Poplar, which...
Okay, so I think what he's going to suggest here is you let him make the Appaloosa, even though you've got Nibiru in hand, because you, as the player who is in Cam's position, you think that your opponent, well, they have to like make an they have to stop me now if I have Appaloosa, right? So you make the Appaloosa, but you let them do it because you activate the backjack in the graveyard since Appaloosa will be stopping the backjack. And then you chain Nibiru because Appaloosa is once per chain. And then you just win the game off of that because they've committed to a full field, right? Is probably what he's going to suggest, I assume, here. But that comes with a big risk, but let's see how he breaks it down.
Which will get you into the same line of combo that you would have done in the original line, and then you get to the kill point super easily. But say we get to the Okon field, and at this point, Dibelstar's normal summon is used, and original Sinful is used. There's not really many extensions left in Cam.
Just by the way, referring back to the initial part of the conversation, this is like a good bluff in a way, right? Bad bluffs are what, you know, some of the suggestions earlier, where like you pretend to have a Nibiru and stuff. That's just cheating, right? Technically, that's illegal, right? You can't do that. This is a good bluff.
Cameron's deck, there's a potential 1-for-1. So if you're in this position, this is the place you want to stop Cameron. So here you could activate Backjack. Now, why would you do this? From Cameron's perspective, this could still be a very meaningful trap. What does it threaten? It could threaten a Welcome Labyrinth, which wouldn't matter too much. Big Welcome Labyrinth is unusable. It could threaten Impermanence, which probably would have been used earlier, so it's unlikely to be this. Dogmatic Punishment, which could prove to be pretty impactful if hitting the Appaloosa plus a Snake Eye Oak, or Destructive Daruma Cannon, which would clear the entire field. Now, Cameron has to wonder for a second, would he have ever held any of these cards rather than using the backjack early before the Appaloosa? And there is some merit to it, because if he had gone for Daruma Cannon or Punishment earlier, he could have been Nightmare Phoenix at that point and then Sinful Spoil afterwards, and we would have been in a pretty similar scenario to the Nibiru coming down. So if you're in Cameron's position here, you have to wonder, okay, this backjack is either a bluff to force something out, or it's a Daruma Cannon. Now, he does have to take a gamble here, right? Because if he thinks that it's a bluff, the game plays out the same way as it would have normally. But if he says, okay, maybe he was trying to protect this from a Nightmare Phoenix, but then let's say that Cameron is actually scared of the Daruma Cannon, and he recognized that maybe Jack had to get greedy and hope that Cameron would let the backjack go through in fear of a Nibiru to force Daruma through, which in itself is a reverse type of play, playing on that variable where that card in hand could be a Nibiru. So Cameron is at a bit of an impasse here. He has to choose to play around Nibiru or Daruma Cannon. Off pure odds alone, you'd reckon that playing around the Nibiru in hand is more statistically likely. But you also have to consider your opponent, how they...
Really, playing around the backjack is more likely, right? Because it's 3 cards deeper into the deck as a more likely response compared to, like... Well, I suppose, like, your opening hand is 5 cards, so maybe mathematically Nibiru is more likely than the backjack hitting... But the backjack could hit any trap, right? It's not like you have 3 copies of Nibiru in your deck. You have, like, 15 good traps in your deck compared to, like, the 3 Nibiru in the opening hand. So statistically, the backjack is more likely to hit something good off of the top than it is for the Nibiru to be in the hand, potentially, right? Is one way to look at it.
They've played and all these things. Now, Cameron very easily could have just said, okay, this is nothing, let it go through, and they killed him anyways. But there's a chance that in fear of getting outplayed or of something crazy happening, he uses the Appaloosa on the backjack, at which point Nibiru is chained, and the game takes a drastic turn. Not only does this backjack now resolve and set the big welcome...
Yeah, so that's what I suggested earlier, was the Appaloosa chained by Nibiru play. However, question, is there a world where you just dark take the backjack to force it out? And then at that point, you know what you're playing around, right? Is that not maybe like a decent line? Does he bring that up at all? Because he's very much fixated on dark bring back specifically Chandragleer to climb up into a 4. But what if you just dark take out the backjack? It doesn't force it? Well, why not? You have a backjack that's sitting on the field now, right? There's no way to dark and Appaloosa? So if you're playing around the Nibiru specifically, then you go through that first line climbing up through the 4 here. Then by that logic, you would just let the backjack go through, right? So if you think it's Nibiru, then you link climb and you just let the backjack stay, because at that point you've asserted that it's a bluff, right? Whereas if you go the other way and you keep the backjack on the field, then at that point you've decided it's not Nibiru and it's the backjack that's the threat potentially. But then if the backjack wasn't used in response to the dark, then you know the backjack is dead. So then you keep climbing up into the Appaloosa, right? Because if you just target backjack and it's real and it's live, then they would just chain the backjack. You lose to Nibiru if you try to hostage the backjack. What if you don't hostage it? What if you just summon it and bring it out the deck, bring out the graveyard? It's just that Celine plus Diabel though, so how do you dark into Jack into Apple without committing the Sinful Spoil? Yeah, so you just do what I suggested there, right? Which is the, you take the backjack, and because by virtue of them not chaining the backjack, then you know it's not live, right? Because then at that point, it's technically, you could argue, is safe to link off because they would have chained it. Because they don't know that you have the extender, right? Potentially. If you darken, they chain backjack, you have to commit your spoil without Appaloosa and lose to Nib. Yes. Yes, but then you lose to Nib, right? But then you have to choose, do you want to play around the Nib? So then you go through the non-backjack play. Basically, TLDR, you're always deciding between backjack or Nibiru. Which one are you playing around, I guess, right? You can't really do both, I suppose, if you're Cam.
All Cameron's plays and sets up Jack perfectly the next turn to steal back victory. And in the case that that happens, that game 2 where Jack had this crazy string of events to claim victory could have been the game 3 of the match, and Jack Z becomes the YCS Raleigh champ.
Jack Z! By the way, I thought this, just as a side note, I thought this entire video was going to specifically be about the rivalry incident, not like the game 2 play.
Instead of Cameron. Or maybe
this is still interesting.
Cameron is so shook from game 1 that in game 2 it goes slightly different, because that was also an incredibly close game.
The grave virus, that was
potentially
funny.
going either way depending on how it's played out. So it goes to show that there was potential here for Jack, and it would have required him to make a very bold gambit, but when you think about it, it's not really bold. Now, there are some cases where you can be greedier and make this type of play based around bluffs and variables to get extra value. However, in this specific case, there was no downside for Jack. The writing was on the wall. He knew original Sinful Spoil was there, and by Nibiruing on the Celine, he's telling Cameron, okay, I have no more Nibiru, and Cameron has no ability to play through any other disruption. If he passes, he's going to lose. So what else is he to do besides try and kill? If the backdeck or last card in hand prove to be some sort of disruption, then he's going to be in a bad spot either way. So Cameron's going to go for game, and he's going to find out it works out, like he actually did in real life. And the downside to the gambit is fairly minimal besides telling your opponent you're open to this type of play, which honestly isn't much of a downside, because telling your opponent that you're able to bluff
you lose anyway
will get them double thinking and gives you even more opportunity to try and get
this
them
was
in the
interesting.
future. It's plays like these that are going to get you back from game.
Just very important to note, by the way, for like legal reasons, this is legal bluffing. Although, to be fair, you could argue, like, I wouldn't really suggest that much of this is bluffing per se, right? It's just kind of like optimizing your cards in the correct order. Because, again, bluffing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very, very gray area. Try not do it in general. But this is probably as close as to a bluff you could call it. But anyway, technicalities aside, still an interesting analysis here.
Games that are otherwise unwinnable. Because if...
It's really interesting that you can actually make, like, a 10-minute video about, like, one play. That's how in-depth and that is how complicated Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, which is really funny to think that people dare suggest that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like, you know, easy and simple, and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Is simple in and of itself.
Continue.
It's like you can literally spend 10 minutes talking about like not just one turn, but one play.
Jack Z just plays his cards for maximum value at the spot where they'd otherwise be most correct, he loses the game every single time. And it's these gambles or bold moves that are going to give you the ability to win games that you otherwise had no chance of winning. And whenever I'm able to pull off something in this type of fashion, it's when I feel the best about my gameplay. It makes me feel like, damn, I earned this, because there are games which you probably just outplayed your opponent.
And by the way, this is the biggest difference between a great player and an okay player, is this point right here. This is the most important thing, right? Because if everyone just assumes that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is played in like this weird like simulation chamber where everyone makes the correct plays and everyone does the correct things, therefore, you know, format bad because we're just comparing hands. It's like, yeah, sure, that's a big assumption to make that everyone is playing perfectly though. The great players are still winning games because they're unlosable games, they're turning into victories. If you make an unwinnable game, if you make an unwinnable game into a winnable game, then you're increasing your win rate, therefore having a higher chance of doing well and success and winning YCSs, etc., etc. That's why these players keep doing really good and keep doing really well. That's the big difference. You know, it sounds easy and simple, but a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Players will just like dismiss a lot of their losses as like, yeah, I got floodgated. Yeah, he opened, 3 hand traps instead of 2. I couldn't play through it. And it's like, you know, potentially, right, a lot of duels are unwinnable. But again, a lot of those unwinnable games can be converted into wins by better players, you know? Sometimes your win condition isn't you playing good. It's your opponent playing worse than you.
I'm also curious to hear what you guys think. What outplays via bluffs or the Schrödinger's trap theory have you guys utilized best? Any specific plays?
This would be
duels that
really
stick
funny to
out
read the
is where
comment
you're really
section.
proud of yourself or of your opponent.
This one
where
time,
you got
I
straight up
activated Honest and
bamboozled.
my opponent
Curious
died.
to see if you guys have any cool stories of your own. Anyways, if you're interested in continuing to elevate your game to the next level, let me know down below as well so I can continue making videos about the more advanced mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh! The statistics, outplays, the mind games, those type of things are incredibly interesting. And that's what's required to really get to the top level in Yu-Gi-Oh! So I would be thrilled to make more videos on this type of topics. Let me know down below, and I'll get them out to you. See you guys on.
Go subscribe to him, chat. Good video. All right. Nice one.